Strommen, and she will speak. She will give a lecture called "Biblical Animals: Returning to Genesis in the Wake of Jacques Derrida." Please.
Hi everyone. First I'd like to just say that this part I'm going to read to you today, or speak to you about today, is part of a bigger piece originally, so I hope it makes some sense as it stands. And also that it will in some form, I figure, as part of my thesis, so it's in no way fully finished. And in that sense I really will appreciate your feedback and thoughts. In what sense of a neighbour, Jacques Derrida asks, should I say that I am close or next to the animal, and that I am following it, and in what type of order or pressure? Being with it in the sense of being close to it, being alongside it, being after it in the sense of the hunt, training, taming, or being after it in the sense of a succession or inheritance? Our train of thought today, then, is precisely this idea of coming after, and what it means to explore the question of the animal today, after the Bible, so to speak, and also in the wake of Jacques Derrida and his critical thinking of animality. We find ourselves in the Bible in approaching the question of animality from the vantage point of much contemporary philosophy on the animal. But we also find ourselves already there, in the sense that we think we know this biblical territory. We know it inside out, by heart even, by cultural osmosis, if not by regular reading. This seems to be the assumption anyhow. Is the Bible to blame for our human-centric structures of thought, in the sense of a weighty cultural inheritance and conceptual baggage? The Bible is referenced by many contemporary philosophers of the animal as a stable signifier, a point of blame. It's held accountable as both fundamental beginning, a textual source to animal subjugation, and an entangling snare, forever named as blamable but never entered or gone near. Hunted down as inherently human-centric, it is immediately made mute without interrogation, a somehow unquestionable, unequivocal beast that requires putting to death. So I'd like to tentatively step over that threshold and pass through a particular biblical text, Genesis 9, via the question of the animal. I'm aware you might not all be familiar with this text. I've partly chosen it because most people do have some vague idea of Genesis, but at the same time, this particular text, but I hope it'll be clear from what I'm saying. It's about Noah and it's after the flood. So what I'd specifically like to question is the notion that biblical texts, and perhaps the narratives in Genesis in particular, can be picked out of context and plotted as a pure, stable source to human centricism, as if the human were created in Genesis fully and purely itself and concomitant with the philosophically patrolled boundaries of the human that have relegated the animal to a sub-subject, situated in a subsidiary, secondary space of marginal otherness. I want us to think a little about inheritance, mythical beginnings, and the question of the animal as it relates to Genesis 9, the textual moment in which the animal is given over into human hands as edible. I also want to say I'm doing a literary reading here, I'm not a literalist. So it's a putative point of blame, this moment where the animal is given over into human hands after this flood that has wiped out all life. Jacques Derrida's important work on the question of the animal lingers around the concepts of law and nakedness, both themes that haunt Genesis 9, and conceptual springboards for thinking about biblical animality. I'll be exploring a few of those thoughts today. So echoing Lacan, Derrida argues that what separates man from beast is the law, what he calls the experience of the law. These are matters of response and responsibility, or rather the potential absence of them. And I quote Derrida, "God himself, like the beast, does not respond, or at least we cannot perhaps count on his response, and therefore cannot be counted on or held accountable for upholding the law. Law and accountability, as these concepts relate to language and contractual agreement, or response and responsibility, are constructed as human." Genesis 9 marks the new beginning after the flood that wipes out all life except Noah and his followers, both animal and familial. Noah then is the mythical father of all humanity, an exception, the last man of the old order and the beginning of the new, commanded to procreate and reproduce humanity. Into the sky with a rainbow, a divine signature. This is where the rainbow appears, which is a symbol of a promise to all living creatures, never again such divine destruction. So the animal is then offered into human hands along with fear and dread. But this gift or supplement of the animal for human consumption is not perhaps simply a death sentence for the animal. Rather, this moment marks a power that is inscribed with pressure and proximity to the animal, imbibing responsibility for life into the human space of agency. The fear and dread given over to humans is the divine excess of power and destruction evoked in the event of the flood, and now a necessary divine dispersion of power, and a mark of repentance in the aftermath, a reverse sacrifice in a sense. This gift from God to humans of animal life, a divine spilling over of power, is necessarily excessive. The addition to the human diet is supplementary, non-essential. Gift and power in one, it is a contract with the divine of responsible handling. Folded into the divine establishment of covenant with his creatures, animality is already written into the terms and conditions of divine contract that marks life as promise, fruitfulness, gift, blessing, not to be divinely destroyed again. The human hand that the animal is given into then is the symbol of capacity for care and compassion, as well as violence and power in this new world. It is a site of decidability. God inserts another clause to human power, folded into the terms and conditions of life. He will ask of every animal and every human an accounting or reckoning. All life, then, is divinely counted and will be accounted for. The infamous line that cites the human made in God's image is what inscribes humanity into divine-like accountability, echoing the divine promise to life at the beginning of Genesis 9. So far from being flattery, it's a call to exceed human self-centeredness and an emptying of hubris. Bergsma and Kahn called Genesis 9:20-27 a compressed, elusive narrative with awkward features, which has been an exegetical puzzle since antiquity. It's about the Noah figure we perhaps hear less about, certainly in popular culture. A Noah figure who consumes his own produce, the vineyard he has cultivated, becoming drunk, undressing, and lying uncovered, naked and flat out in his tent. When he is discovered and exposed in this state by his son Ham, Noah's response is an exaggerated curse that echoes the sovereign Godhead's curse of humanity in Genesis 8. The awkwardness or puzzle in this question is why this exposure should matter quite so much, and why Noah curses Ham, not Ham, but Ham's son Canaan, who seems to have nothing to do with the event. So Derrida writes that the property unique to animals, what in the last instance distinguishes them from man, is their being naked without knowing it. They are consequently not properly naked as such. In short, Derrida says, obliquely referring again to Genesis, animals are without consciousness of good and evil. And this is perhaps something we can discuss later. Thereby linking the specifically human coming to awareness of nakedness in the biblical creation narrative, with Eve and the eating of the apple, an event which results in self-consciousness, shame and clothing, to notions of accountability and guilt, right and wrong. In other words, gaining the preconditions for ethics and law. So Noah's nakedness and exposure is an undoing of the human that stages the proximity to animality, lurking beneath surface proprieties, and the power in human language in naming who or what is subject, being able to speak and therefore also curse, and the breakdown of this linguistic domination. Drunk and unconscious, asleep and naked in his tent, he is exposed to the gaze of the other who captures him in this state. Noah's shame and cursing, his self-conscious embarrassment and anger is excessive. For a moment he has lost his manhood. He is improperly beheld, less than what he ought to be, less than human, without language, power, consciousness, or rational faculties. Losing himself and becoming beast, he doubles his gesture with an excessive curse as if he were an untamed or hunted beast, defending himself from threat. But also significantly, he is emptying out divine-like terror upon his offspring, as if he himself were the divine Father or sovereign Godhead. In a moment, Noah is both beast and divine. His cursing of Ham's innocent son Canaan is a sign of all-powerful divine sovereignty, evoking fear and dread, directed not at the animal, but at the human, who is made animal through Noah's curse. Noah has turned divine power to human account, reproducing the excess of divine destruction and making of Canaan less than human, the lowest of the low, a slave like a tamed beast. And this is in his curse. He cursed him to be a slave forever. Clothing is one of the necessarily endless properties of the human. This is one of Derrida's points. It's a mark of technicity. This supplementary human requirement for clothing is a de-animalizing gesture then, a token of civilized propriety, a signature of human, as opposed to beast, barbarian, savage, slave. Shame and technicity need to be thought together, Derrida argues. Noah is an exemplar of human civilization, reproducer of life, producer of consumables, a figure of technicity. The lines of production or reproduction of human life, that is the seemingly endless shopping listing of genealogical name-dropping in the passage that follows Genesis 9, one of these biblical passages which is Noah, son of, father of, etc., etc., etc. These sort of genealogical name-droppings are signs or signatures of civilization emerging out of cultivation of creation, technologies that cannot be untangled from the consumption of animals, as suddenly sliced from the inedible consumer that is the human. Culture is being cut out from nature, cutting the animal from it as well, despite the divine call for proximity to and pressure towards animality and the promise to all life. Consuming also the fruits of the earth, Noah's vineyard and consequent drunkenness signifies excess and exposure. His unconscious nakedness and shameful state of being reveals the abyssal gaze of the other, and this is a term Derrida uses about facing the animal. The abyssal gaze of the other, a sort of a relation that is both close and abyssal, secret, other. Noah is emptied of his humanness. He faces the limits of man, speechless, slurring, unknowing, flat out. To be alive in this biblical text is always to be both less and more, never entirely fitting one's own skin, a constant slippaging rather, or parasitical relationality. What I've tried to briefly point to in this reading is not that the Bible can easily stand in for pro-animal protestations or that it can blithely be pinned up as antithetical to a more nuanced, attentive and caring tract of animality. And one of the things I haven't gone through here, but which I do in my longer paper, is go through this idea of biblical blame in a lot of contemporary philosophy in much more detail. Either such a stance, I argue, either a sort of pro or anti in terms of the Bible, which is obviously a huge, complex set of texts. Either such a stance would be simplistic and reductive. Reassessing biblical animals and animality cannot be a matter of hunting down, capturing or taming biblical meaning and message for a certain cause, but rather an opening up to this ancient scriptural archive and its strange creatures, human, animal, divine, which I think can help to rethink some of these stark divisions and categories we've sort of drawn up in terms of thinking about creation. Divine law, repentance, and call for responsibility arguably set in motion an emptying of hubris from the human, as well as a giving over, an ever-exceeding, a sort of power in responsibility. We could always do more, say more, be more in relation to creation. The question of the animal today demands response and responsibility in one movement, in which our assumptions concerning the ontological status of the animal as a homogeneous marginal category of being, made producible as a thing of consumption, and constituting a conceptual stitching of the human as comfortably complete and sovereign self-possessing master, are destabilised and deconstructed engaging with our cultural history, biblical texts and their afterlives. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. Now we have 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you, that was a very interesting lecture. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what degree does the Bible demonstrate that animals have a sense of moral agency, if any? You talked about good and evil and whether animals are capable of that. And the reason I'm interested in is because I'm doing some anthropological fieldwork with Jain communities. And in Jainism, animals have absolute moral agency. This is one of the reasons why, for example, in India, very many of the Hindu or Jain rescue sanctuaries will not take in carnivores or predators because they believe that eagles and dogs and animals such like this that eat other animals or attack other animals are moral agents and they're responsible for their own destiny, if you like. So could you just tell me, compared to sort of Jainism, how does the Bible situate the Bible? I know it's not a text, but is there a general theme of how animals have moral agency or that they don't?
It would, like I say, it'd be hard for me. Well, I wouldn't want to make a generalised statement about it. And I think, and it probably requires a bit more thinking through for me. I mean, I'm looking at a number of biblical texts, and this is sort of my first. But I mean, one thing that comes up in the Bible is a definite sense of an animal-divine relationship. You know, animals working for God, or animals in the service of God, or a sort of divine animal communication going on. I mean, in terms of sort of, well, I suppose you could construe it differently. You could say it's a sort of, that's a sign of, you know, all-powerful divine, you know.
And they're totally subject
exactly,
to that.
Exactly. But then again, what I find interesting about working on Genesis is partly that it's sort of very much held up as a sort of, you know, human in the image of God, and therefore animals are sort of the negative. And similarly, you could say with women, and you know, there are interesting sort of stereotypes that get sort of reproduced through that. And I think it's not easy to say that that's not the case in certain parts, but there are interesting bits to do with certainly agency, and I mean, one of the things I haven't talked about today, but the sort of the idea of the serpent in Eden being is a complex sort of character, and I think can be, you know, the serpent is always a sort of an evil thing, and no one talks about the sort of serpent agency, and I don't really know how you go about discussing that, but in one sense, I mean, part of that is the serpent exposes a divine lie. You know, God sort of says, if you eat of this tree, you will die, and the serpent says, this isn't true, you won't die, and there's a sort of, in a way, it's sort of serpent has the last word there. There are strange, interesting things like that. But as for moral agency, I'm not sure.
It's an interesting line of inquiry.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I think that distinction. I mean, Derrida there is very much referring to this moment in Genesis and this idea about nakedness and morality and how that fits together. So yeah, but I'm very interested to explore that further.
Yeah, just following that, it seems a very interesting point. That, I wonder if that could lie a little behind the unclean, the non-kosher element of the predatory bird, that no predatory animal can be consumed by a person because they have ingested the blood of another animal, and you can't ingest blood. So
yeah, that's. I mean, that fits.
They could have inherited that from a basis. The Indian subcontinent.
That's interesting. And this Genesis 9 passage talks about, you know, about lifeblood and this. I mean, I really hope this wasn't completely incomprehensible, because a lot of it is sort of textual detail in terms of sort of the ideas of covenant, and there's a lot of sort of setting out of what's right and what's wrong with life taking, and that's very much part of this complexity to do with God giving humans, animals to eat, but at the same time there's a sort of, but you mustn't eat animals with lifeblood in them. What does that mean? And then there's very sort of, and you mustn't kill your neighbour, I think there's sort of a lot of complex relations there where it seems to be sort of going back and forth in terms of what is okay and what is not okay, and there's a real sort of, interesting dynamic there.
Again, just following on that, it seems to me that it bore kind of strange fruit during the medieval period, and of course there's a sort of biblical ideas underlying medieval jurisprudence, but there you certainly had actually going to the point of animals being on trial, and many animals were hung or burned as a kind of capital punishment that today seems almost incomprehensible to us, but it's certainly part of that same lineage and points to some sort of theological idea of animal agency.
That's very interesting, actually, and this idea about the law. I mean, that's Derrida's tack. It's it's the idea of the law with a capital L. That's what sort of both the beast and the sovereign is outside, and that's partly how we are limiting off certain creatures or living agents or whatever. And that the idea of sort of taking an animal to court is sort of absurd to us today, but it's interesting that perhaps that's not been the case always.
Another question?
Just thinking, just about the way that dominion became delineated differentiated between certain species. I mean, Noah takes upon the ark all of the animal creation through creation to preserve the ecology of the planet, presumably. But we end up with a select number of animals that we do things to, in the main, we eat. And then there's the prohibition against, for instance, pork. I'm just wondering how these things kind of evolved out of a fairly simple, straight relationship as you described it. Where these differentiations come from ultimately. We can eat some animals, we can't eat others, or if of the Judaic tradition.
I think that's why. That's why I'm interested in looking at these sort of textual sources to sort of, mythical ideas and how have they, how have they become subsumed in culture as just sort of assumptions we hold on to today. That, this idea of dominion and sort of an assumed human dominion or domination, and I don't know enough about the sort of the ancient world, or the sort of the Hebrew way of life in terms of where this is sort of situated, to sort of fully understand the whole set of relations between. But I mean, food was certainly not a simple matter. Who you eat and what's good. And I mean, my supervisor, who worked very closely with this sort of thing, is sort of writes sort of about sacrifice and what sacrifice means in terms of sort of biblical sacrifice, in terms of holding on to ideas between divine, human, animal. It's a sort of way of reproducing these boundaries by certain things are allowed to be sacrificed, and that sort of upholds these distinctions.
Could I just come back and say that there is something slightly more, even more mundane about the relationships in the taboos against eating certain animals, in that if you look at the period in which these creation myths emerged, these were mainly among nomadic peoples. It wouldn't have made sense if you're a nomadic person to herd, say, pigs, porcine breeds, and so it's just a way of just pragmatically, if you like, socially engineering survival mechanisms to ensure that the group survives in those environments. It doesn't make sense to have pigs or certain other animals, which will weigh you down, present an enormous drag effect on the survival of the group.
Yeah, and that's one way of reading these mythical or biblical texts or myths or creation stories. What is sort of written in the aftermath, sort of explaining how things have come about. Giving things a sort of a certain meaning. And I suppose one thing I'm interested in doing is seeing how they filtrated into things that perhaps started off as purely pragmatic or reasonable practices within a certain sort of cultures and societies and ways of living have sort of percolated into, today, contemporary society and our ways of thinking in a sort of digested format, which has nothing to do particularly with its origins or that sort of genealogy of ideas. Okay, thank you.
I would like to welcome our second speaker, Catherine Duxbury. She will give a lecture called The Therefore I Am, Critical Feminist Perspectives on the Nature.
Right. Slight change in title, but never mind. I want to start off with a little anecdote. I'm a FE teacher. I teach 16 to 19-year-olds, mainly girls actually, who don't have any GCSE qualifications, who are known as rebels and quite badly behaved. So I was talking to them about nature a few weeks ago, and I said to one of them, so what's nature to you? I don't know really, like my mum. So this got me thinking. So nature and mother nature, and it's kind of like directed my line of inquiry into my argument for my thesis. So it's kind of jumbled up at the moment. I'm still organising things, but I hope that it kind of comes across as making some sort of sense to you. I'm using kind of like feminist psychoanalysis, post-structuralist psychoanalysis, and I'm looking at kind of like deconstructing the natural. I think it's really important to kind of deconstruct, to question the concept of nature. Nature varies through time, through place, through different cultures. So I'm focusing my research mainly in the West, but I would like to eventually branch out and look cross-culturally as well. And my main argument is that nature has been repressed within the self, the Western self, over time. And this is kind of like our versions of nature are now refracted through a discourse of women and animals, how women and animals are represented in Western society. So this repression can actually have implications for power and dominance, not only over the animal, but also over the woman, because there's parallels can be drawn between women and animals in particular. So my main objectives is what is nature, why women and animals as a focus, and how can a post-structuralist feminist psychoanalysis, big words, be used to critique the natural. So it's as much about nature and animals as it is about sex and gender as well. So nature is female. Many ecofeminists draw distinctions between the female and nature. Nature is female. The female is nature. And it's kind of like posed a genderization of nature, or feminization of nature is a better word to use. And women can be seen as another, nature as other, separate from ourselves, something to be subjugated, something to be dominated. But it's not the fact, I would argue, that women are closer to nature, but women in some shape or form in the Western world represent nature, and nature represents the female. And Caroline Merchant, in her book, The Death of Nature, has traced historically the connections between the feminine and the natural. So I'm kind of drawing on her conclusions there. So, however, many ecofeminists, their notions of the sense of self, I feel requires problematization and exploration. The reification of such things as the self and nature has led to ecofeminism being criticised for its essentialist leanings. The way in which women and nature have been conceptualised historically in Western societies has resulted in the animalisation of women and naturalising the domination of women, animals and nature. So I feel ecofeminism has failed to locate animals as central to any discussion of nature with regards to the self, women, gender and the repression of the other as part of the self in a phallocentric order. And what I mean by phallocentric order is it's dominated by the male, basically the phallus, the male phallus. So it's a patriarchal phallocentric order. So I've just got some examples here, just contemporary kind of adverts or poses. This is from America's Next Top Model. They did a meet shoot. And this is an Orangino advert from 2008, I think it is. And you can see kind of like the equation with women and meat, but also the feminisation of kind of like animals, or the animalisation of women as well. And what I want to do with these kind of things, I want to do a cultural history of kind of advertisements and the representation of women and animals. And I want to trace kind of like, or kind of like look at and analyse the discourses, the dominant discourses in society about women and animals, and how that reveals our understandings of nature. I hope that makes sense. I'm a bit nervous. So psychoanalysis, for my part, is actually psychoanalytic theory could be and should be appropriated as a political weapon. It can demonstrate the way the unconscious structures and frame contemporary discourse on and about nature. Phallocentrism, in all its manifestations, depends on the image of a castrated woman. Women and animals as other help give order to the world, and it is giving order to a patriarchal world as well. So the function of the woman, the animal, or the other, as is known, in forming the patriarchal unconscious world, is about looking at kind of language. Lacan talks about kind of language being the gateway to the unconscious, or the unconscious is structured like language. So it's definitely a focus on kind of Lacanian kind of terms. And thus, women's desire is being subjugated to her image. So this involves the destruction of pleasure, natural world, extinction of species, all connects to the phallocentric order, and possibly the castration complex, but I'm not sure about that at the moment. So what men fear, and ironically desire, is in a narcissistic fashion. So part of like the language used, the symbolic, in Lacanian terms, is about kind of patriarchy and the use of language that appropriates the domination and subjugation of women and animals. And Lacan talks about the real, symbolic and the imaginary. So Lacan stresses the linguistic structure of the unconscious as a site of repressed meanings, and the imaginary structure of subjectivity, acquired, like the unconscious, at the point of entry of the individual into the realm of language acquisition in infancy. The imaginary is a term used to describe the pre-edible identification of the infant with its image in the mirror phase, according to Lacan. The child here is neither masculine nor feminine until the child acquires language. This mirror phase involves the recognition of the child's own self in the mirror, and thus through the mirror phase begins a process of acquiring gendered subjectivity and a place in the symbolic order. The symbolic is hugely relevant in the analysis of nature, and why women and animals in particular are constructed as natural. The symbolic, as argued by Lacan, is the social and cultural order in which we live our lives as conscious gendered subjects. So women, animals and nature have no position in the symbolic order, except in relation to men, as mothers, nurturers, utilitarian objects for self-gratification. The theory that women have no access to the symbolic order, and thus the non-human, means a development of theory needs to occur to occupy a space where women's language and the language of the non-human can be articulated as a constant, unrepressed threat to the patriarchal symbolic order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have 10 minutes for questions. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Rather naive question about the mirror phase, having a youngish infant myself. Is that meant literally? Is that process of self-formation dependent on actually having a real experience with mirrors? I suppose any shiny surface would do, or how do you
No, I think it's also reflected through the mother as well, so it's about the mother and child relationship. And that's through the mother and child relationship you acquire that gendered subjectivity, which is imaginary, this imaginary wholeness. And that's part of the problem of kind of how women become subjugated, and also animals. You can kind of like, there's parallel oppressions involved, I feel. Does that help?
Yeah, so the mirror is a kind of metaphor for reflectiveness generally.
Yeah.
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 In which case, I mean, I'm rather ignorant of post-structuralist theory, but that does remind me somewhat of Rousseau's argument for much so. Is that well known, that connection?
The mirror phase, I don't know about the connection between Rousseau and Lacan, but the mirror phase is very well known. And it's applied a lot in film theory and narrative cinema. Yes.
Me? Thank you very much. There's a point of information and then a query where I'm a bit confused, possibly about something you said. Point of information is that there's a very good website called Suicide Food, which I don't know if you're aware of, but what it is, it's a place where advertising imagery is collected that shows animals enjoying themselves being consumed.
Right.
So it's, for example, it's images of pigs on barbecues with flames around them, and they're happy and they're waving and they're smiling as they're being cooked alive. So I would check it out, Suicide Food. I'm a little confused about one point, and forgive me if I misunderstand it. Did you say that the ecofeminism is being criticised for not paying sufficient attention to the animal issue? Was that a point you made?
From what I've found out so far, ecofeminism focuses on nature and connections to nature. The animal issue kind of like occurred in the late 80s and early 90s, as far as I'm aware. Do you want to contradict me on that?
I don't want to contradict you, but the ecofeminism I'm aware of is issues of the Carol Adams and the Marty Keel.
Yeah, Carol J. Adams is probably the only person.
Well, I would argue I would contradict you on that, because I think there's actually quite a group, and I don't,
Okay.
But we can talk about that later.
That'd be great, actually.
Just following on from that point in discussing Carol Adams, you're probably aware of the sexual politics of the concept of the absent referent. And what I find particularly interesting from a feminist point of view is that it's almost like the absent referent with regards to feminism is no longer relevant in our society to a degree. And let me explain why I say that. Because it's almost like a large degree of women, particularly...
Could you speak a little louder?
Sorry.
Just a little.
A large degree of women, particularly in Western cultures, are implicit to their own subjugation. And what I'm referring to is the rise of lads mags and this kind of new thing that came late 1990s, wasn't it? And so it almost became cool for women to be around with the guys and engaging in behaviour that was traditionally criticised by feminists. And I was wondering, when I was looking at your advertisements, and I was thinking about Carol Adams' book, do you think that's something that, where has that come from? And do you think that's something that really needs addressing as a point of issue? And it's almost come in tandem, if you like, with the oppression of animals. There's been an increase in genetic engineering and these kind of things. Do you think there's something that's coming together? And Kim's touched on this before about these interrelated oppressions. Is this something that's coming together for a good reason? Is it part of what you're looking at? What's your opinion?
I think that's a really, really good point, actually. And I think it's probably tied up, that's why I'm focusing on the unconscious and language being like a voice of the unconscious, so to speak. Because some people would argue that, women have become perhaps more emancipated.
Yeah.
However, it's emancipated within a framework, a phallocentric order. And language can help us understand that and analyse that.
Yeah, brilliant.
Any question? Does he take someone? Okay. The third one will speak Nathan Stephens-Griffin, and the speech is called Doing Critical Animal Studies Differently, Learning from Lorde.
It's quite daunting going on after them two very good presentations, so I'm just going to have some water.
Particularly when one's a feminist presentation.
Yeah. Don't remind me. Okay, so it's actually quite good because a lot of what Catherine was talking about and Hannah kind of links to what I'm doing. like, and sort of the discussion about the mirror, like what I want to talk about is reflexivity in research. So it's kind of, my presentation's kind of aimed at people within academia who are wanting to research matters around, I guess, critical animal studies and how we can kind of think outside of the current paradigm, or at least play around with it a bit. So I'm just going to skip ahead. And I'll go back. So I saw this recently on YouTube, you might have seen it. An author called Breeze Harper asked Angela Davis a question at a conference in America somewhere. She asked Angela Davis, very famous black feminist activist and author, about veganism and about animals, and Angela Davis kind of came out as kind of sympathetic to veganism, and it was a pretty cool thing. Like, she says, I'll read it. It seems to me that not knowing how to recognise that the food we eat masks so much cruelty is a sign of how capitalism has colonised our minds. And that's kind of like a link to the starting point of what I want to talk about, which is this idea of intersectionality. So like looking at the interconnectedness of different forms of oppression, so looking at gender struggle and animal rights and anti-racism and how we can, in a, I guess, like a critical theory sense, join the dots and think of oppression not as this separate thing, but as something that's interconnected, and not just acknowledge other struggles, but incorporate them into our own struggles and that kind of thing. And that's like, that is what critical animal studies is kind of about. But for me, like as an academic, I feel like we're often / always, except for somewhere like this, forced to kind of have the conversation on terms we didn't have any part in creating, like within a sort of epistemological framework that is sort of an anathema to what we believe. And like, so like we've embraced this idea of intersectional radical political resistance, but like that doesn't necessarily filter into how we do things methodologically, because we still have to work within a very fixed system of the academic system, and so I'm just thinking about that kind of stuff. And so I'm going to talk about Audre Lorde, but not for very long really. So yeah, Audre Lorde, born in New York, a second generation Caribbean American immigrant, a poet, an essayist and a political activist. Someone else who's very strongly tied to intersectionality. She wrote on a lot of issues. She didn't write about animals, I don't think, that I've come across, but she wrote about her experiences of homophobia, of sexism, of racism, and of like class struggle, and of how these things all intersect. And she was also big at confronting racism within the feminist movement, so a big critic of like white feminism in the 60s and how racist it was, how it left women of colour out of the equation a lot of the time. So I'm going to talk about a couple of her essays, one that she wrote. And I'm talking about it because it kind of has impacted on the way that I'm doing my research, which I'll talk about in a bit. It's like, yeah, so she's got this essay, you might have come across it, called Poetry is Not a Luxury. It's kind of very short, it's like 4 pages, but it's like pretty good. And it's kind of links to what Catherine was talking about, like the essentialism stuff and like nature, I guess, and these kind of dualisms. And so she's talking about the way that poetry has been conceptualized within a value dualism as something not worthwhile, not valuable. And so in the same sense we've got this like dichotomy of reason and rational thought, and then emotion on the other side. Emotion's something feminine and worthless, like we just need this kind of rational, scientific way of looking at the world, and that's progress. But of course, we know that like rationality on its own can lead to horrendous things happening, and does on a daily basis. So it isn't as clear cut as that, and so she's kind of arguing that in order to like convey the sort of if we're writing about critical animal studies, it is emotional stuff. A lot of it, it's horrible stuff that we're dealing with, and to just take emotion out of the equation methodologically and epistemologically is kind of doing a disservice to the very essence of what we're doing, I think. So yeah, capitalism dehumanizes us, makes us these rational sort of beings, or at least we exist within a framework where rationality is much more valuable. And so we need to work against that. And that links to this other essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, which kind of continues the same theme. Sorry. Yeah, so, but she talks about difference as well, and sort of acknowledging difference. So again, it's intersectionality, it's different struggles coalescing, but not ignoring the differences and not ignoring the different struggles and different forms of oppression, but acknowledging them and letting the sort of the tension that creates spark like a dialectic, is the nice phrase that she uses, because she's a poet and I'm just an idiot. But yeah, like, so we must not reproduce white patriarchal capitalist speciesist. I've added that in, modes of thinking in our effort to overcome oppression. You know, in the way we do our research, we need to think outside of that kind of discourse, I guess. Yeah, seeing that. So what I'm thinking about is like reflexivity and reflexive social science. And like after sort of bashing white men for a while, I've got a few white men's quotes. So I've got, like, I don't know anything about science, but this is a Heisenberg quote. What we observe is not nature herself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. So that's his essentialist language there. But yeah, I think that there's a valid point there in that scientists are comfortable enough to acknowledge that when they do their experiments, they're enacting a version of reality based on what they observe. They can't directly access the reality of that moment. So regardless of your ontological sort of perspective, you need to acknowledge that there is somewhere down the line a standpoint and there's a subjectivity in the process. And when you're doing social research, when you're talking to human beings, and there's this like hermeneutic kind of constant, like, people react, whereas particles don't know that you're writing stuff about them, whereas human beings do, and that, you know, we're all so interconnected that we need to acknowledge that in the research that we do. And so Pierre Bourdieu talks about like meta-sociology and reflexive sociology, where we're not just sociologists, but we're talking about the process and like not leaving that out, not leaving that aside, but like having that grounded at the very root of what we're doing as we conduct our research. And then that links to sort of what's being described as the crisis of representation in the social sciences. So like things like previously very entrenched values like reliability, validity, objectivity kind of being called into question a little bit, and people saying, well, actually these things aren't, a lot of the time we're artificially guaranteeing validity for the purposes of the paper, passing the Viva or whatever. What can we, like, you know, untighten the belt a bit and like breathe a bit more and acknowledge that it is quite a messy process a lot of the time, and like, so doing social research isn't this clinical, easily defined thing, and we should let that percolate into our writing a bit. Yeah, so, and Denizen talking about blurring of the boundary between fieldwork and writing, which again is like a nice dualism that we've constructed, like we've got the fieldwork and then we've got the writing, but it isn't so simple, I don't think, and like, we can't remove ourselves totally from the process. So, for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about my research. and apologies to anyone who's seen this before anywhere. So yeah, I'm a PhD student, and I'm looking at the biographies of vegans and animal rights activists. And like, so within the context of everything I've just talked about, I guess. And so I've got the three main methods that I'm using. One is that I'm using biographical interviews. One is that I'm asking participants in my research to create comics about their lives, so that I don't just have the interview data, I've also got data that's come from them outside of the interview. And I'm also producing an autoethnographic comic about my own experiences of the research process. So this is me learning from Lorde, this is me trying to inject a bit of poetry into the sort of the writing, as well as the practical research. So I might just have to skip this because I don't have that much time, but yeah. Project's called Queering Veganism because I'm sort of integrating some queer theory in there. So queer theory is a critical social theory which seeks to challenge and destabilise fixed identity categories. So going back again to what you were talking about like sort of not reifying this identity category of female and male as being like objective and universal and like singular, but like thinking outside of them. And so I'm kind of incorporating that and looking at vegans as a queer sort of sample for a number of reasons, which I talk about loads, but I can't really talk about for very long. But hopefully that makes sense. I guess you can maybe ask me about it. But yeah, but queer theory challenges essentialism. Veganism challenges essentialism. Animal rights activists are labelled terrorists, discursively delegitimised, in much the same way that, you know, I'm going to move on, sorry. So yeah, this is the pictures before were from a comic. And here's a bit of autoethnography. I forgot to bring a comic to this room, so I was going to give you all a comic, but it's over in the reception area where I've been standing most of the day. So yeah, come and ask me for one if you want one. So what autoethnography is, it's like a research process that acknowledges the author within the research and sort of works against that tendency to erase subjectivity and imply objectivity where it doesn't necessarily exist. So it's like a process where the author is visible within the research, and I thought, what better way to be visible than to have a comic where I'm actually visible. And yeah, and so asking activists and vegans to talk about their lives and then using comics in that context is like, there's a lot of, I think at least, methodological justifications for doing that. Allowing people to tell their stories, like people want to talk about their lives, especially when you know, day to day, you're kind of invisibly different to everyone around you. Except when it comes to lunchtime when you're sitting on your own eating a bag of Walker's salt and vinegar crisps. Yeah, and like telling stories promotes empathy, so it's harder to sort of dismiss someone or a group of people as like terrorists and extremists if you know a bit about their story, and you can really kind of pick apart the really, really inconsistent discourse surrounding terrorism and the way it's prosecuted. And biographical research is well known to generate rich data, and using visuals is good, I think. So yeah, there's the conclusion. So I guess my point that I'm trying to make maybe is that intersectionality is great, but we could also apply it better methodologically. And being reflexive is not a bad thing. And that's not to say that positivist or empiricist-like research is worthless, far from it. I think a lot of what I'm doing rests on it, but it's just about not trying to manufacture reality out of for the necessity of pleasing a big market-centric system. Yeah, so that is where I will end my rambling. Thanks.
questions or comments? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm a bit disturbed by your talk, which you probably think is quite a good thing, but I'm just afraid that in your aims at the beginning, that the conversation is a structure that you've not been part of the construction, that you're doing the establishment's work for them in subverting the value of CPA studies.
CPA studies.
You know, critical perspectives on animals, human animal studies. But you know, it's taken years to get into the mainstream in academia to take animal subjects seriously, and immediately come in and seem to be subverting it, seem to be enabling it to not be taken seriously.
So you're saying my research is not taken seriously, that's your point?
Well, I'm afraid that it might not be.
Because I've done this talk at I did it at the ESA, which is like, there was no other vegans in the room, and they loved the idea. The suits upstairs at universities love the idea of public engagement and impact, right? They love it when your research is different, when it's getting out there a bit. So I've had the exact opposite response from the mainstream, I think.
Can I just make a comment following on from that? I think, really for me, our liminality is the key to our success. And I think that it's really obvious how Audre Lorde has influenced you when you talk about the Master's Tool essay. And in saying that, basically, you've translated that into your own research, that the normal way of doing things will never dismantle the Master's house. It will not change the system, if you like, loose sway. And we're trying to make a change. So I actually think that I disagree with the lady who commented before that liminality can be the key to our success. And I'm very excited about these different non-stuffy ways of academics engaging with the people that they study. And certainly with my own experiences, I touched on it before, I do fieldwork with Jayans, and I'm writing up my research at the moment. And I write that with my head, but also with my heart. And I am very much in there. And my reasons, my biased reasons for choosing that particular community to do research with, because as a practicing vegan, I would find it much easier to work with a religious community who have attitudes loosely similar to my own, but also because I wanted to discover, is there something that they have that can contribute to the way that I do activism outside of academia. So in contrast to that lady, I actually think liminality is the key to our success, and something has to be different.
Yeah, and I think also it's like a battle's fought on many fronts as well.
Exactly.
Oh, right.
So I'm probably the only person I know that's doing comics. I think someone else in human geography maybe. But yeah, I think a bit of difference isn't such a bad thing. Maybe you're the mainstream methodologically that I'm working against.
Well, I tried a long time to get a PhD subject accepted, and nobody would touch it. And when I finally made it, I thought, right, at last, you know, I'm sort of getting in there. And I just feel that it's happening now. I'm so excited by the amount of work that's being done in academia in CPA. And I'm just afraid that it may now be considered to be a bit outre, a bit sort of, well, it's on the anarchist wing, it's not kind of really where we're at, it's you know, don't touch it because it's too dangerous or something.
So
Sorry?
I'm funded by the ESRC, so they obviously don't mind.
Well done, you.
Well, no, if you're making the point that, like, I'm undermining the animal rights movement by being too out there methodologically, am I right in thinking that? That's what you said.
Yeah, but it could...
But to who? It seems to be just to you, because the mainstream, the ESRC, which is not a vegan organisation, has funded this research because of its methodological distinctness. So I'm saying that maybe if we move outside of that bubble, outside of trying to talk in their language and talk in our own language, we might make some, you know, progress, maybe.
I can't help thinking that you could both be right, but I'm not sure which one is, other than that, you know, it's fascinating really to hear the exchange. I can find that I identify with both sides. I mean, what you say about the suits loving anything to do with public engagement is absolutely right. I mean, so much so that they bizarrely sort of deconstruct themselves because they really don't care what the hell it's about, just so long as it's public engagement, wider dissemination. I mean, they maybe even rendered themselves incapable of recognising that there might be some different content to different types of methodology. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And thus, what better way, one might think, than gaining some, having an audience and achieving some platform, some set of resources than being able to appeal to right absolutely at the heart of the mainstream of modern academia. I mean, that all sounds very plausible. But then I also find myself partly sympathising with the other point of view that there are many people, you know, both academics working within this critical animal studies framework and without. I mean, for what it's worth, I would count myself amongst them that take a more mainstream, orthodox, and perhaps in your terms, epistemologically and ontologically conservative attitude. I just find that I sympathise with both sides, and I honestly wouldn't know how to adjudicate. But maybe the conclusion must be that there is room for all such strategies playing around, whether one plays seriously or slightly more playfully. At the end of the day, what matters are good consequences.
I just got a little comment. I was just wondering, I don't know how much, I mean, I'm obsessed with Derrida, so I'm thinking that, but I don't know how much you
just a little bit through Richard Twine. Have you read stuff he's written?
Not hugely. But I just struck me when you talk about poetry in the beginning, because Derrida has a really interesting essay called "What is Poetry?" and it's about a hedgehog, and it's a very interesting sort of playful essay, but really about poetry as the kind of forgotten or the erased or crossed over kind of subject of philosophy. Philosophy has wanted to sort of suppress or avoid poetry at all costs, and about the idea of how the metaphors and poetic language always sort of sneaks back in. And I wondered if you could frame it in that sort of argument as well. Because that's, I mean, Derrida's other things talk about the animal as the negated, forgotten, sidestepped subject of Western philosophy, and a kind of long-standing discourse that has always wanted to subject it as what's other to human. And I wonder if you could maybe use that connection.
Yeah, it's something that, I mean, I haven't looked into Derrida as much as I perhaps should, and I'd probably get a friendly response from a room full of Derridean non-vegans, but which is the irony. But yeah, I will look into it.